The war didn't begin in 2022. It began in silence, in boardrooms, in backroom deals, in the slow betrayal of promises no one ever meant to keep. For decades, the fuse burned, hidden beneath treaties, pipelines, and flags, and when it finally exploded, the world acted surprised. But Ukraine? Ukraine saw it coming, from Soviet domination to proxy battles to the return of empire. This is not just a war, it's the final reckoning of the Cold War, and it began long before the tanks crossed the border. From 1922 to 1991, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, though calling it a union masked decades of oppression. Stalin's collectivization policies in the 1930s triggered the Holodomor, an artificial famine that killed millions of Ukrainians. Russian language and culture were imposed. Dissent was crushed. But beneath the surface, a sense of national identity never died. By the 1980s, amid the decay of the USSR, Ukraine became one of the most restive republics, home to growing calls for sovereignty. When the Soviet Union crumbled in 1991, Ukraine seized its chance. In a December referendum, over 90% voted for independence, including a majority in Crimea. Ukraine inherited the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal, but soon agreed to disarm. The 1994 Budapest Memorandum saw Russia, the US, and the UK promise to respect Ukraine's borders in exchange. But that promise would prove far more fragile than anyone imagined. Russia watched its empire fall apart and saw NATO growing closer to its doorstep. The 2000s brought chaos and corruption to Ukraine. Oligarchs carved the country into empires of influence. Russia used gas pipelines as leverage, threatening to shut off supply during political disputes. Meanwhile, Ukraine's divided identity deepened, a pro-European West and a pro-Russian East. Moscow funneled money and support into sympathetic politicians like Viktor Yanukovych, but the people pushed back. In 2004, after blatant election fraud, millions took to the streets. The Orange Revolution was born, and for the first time, Ukraine chose a pro-Western path, enraging the Kremlin. Despite the Orange Revolution, pro-Russian forces regrouped. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych returned to power. This time, the Kremlin had learned its lesson. Influence was best wielded quietly. Russian investment flowed into infrastructure, energy, and media. Ukrainian politics tilted eastward again. But in 2013, a breaking point came. Yanukovych suddenly pulled out of an EU association deal, instead accepting a $15 billion bailout from Moscow. The decision sparked protests. Masses filled Kyiv's Maidan Square. They didn't just want Europe. They wanted sovereignty, dignity, and an end to corruption. They called it the Revolution of Dignity, and Russia was watching with fury. February 2014. Amid escalating protests, Yanukovych fled Ukraine. Within days, unidentified soldiers, little green men, seized control of Crimea. They were Russian. Moscow denied it, then admitted it. In March, after a hastily arranged referendum under military occupation, Russia annexed Crimea. The West condemned the move. Sanctions followed, but Putin didn't stop. Armed conflict erupted in eastern Ukraine, where Russian-backed separatists declared independence in Donetsk and Luhansk. What began as a protest had become a proxy war. Ukraine was bleeding, and the world had entered a new phase. For the next 8 years, a simmering war consumed eastern Ukraine. Over 14,000 people died. Towns were shattered. Ceasefires came and went. Russia claimed it wasn't involved, while supplying weapons, training, and intelligence to the separatists. International monitors like the OSCE documented the reality. This was a hybrid war. Meanwhile, Ukraine deepened ties with NATO and the EU. In Moscow, the message was clear. Ukraine was slipping away from the Russian orbit and had to be pulled back. NATO wasn't expanding by force, but it was expanding. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, all once part of the Soviet sphere, had joined NATO by 2004. Putin viewed this as betrayal. He drew a red line. Ukraine must never join. But NATO left the door open, if only rhetorically. In 2008, the alliance declared that Ukraine and Georgia will become members someday. In Russia's eyes, that was a provocation. In Ukraine's eyes, it was a lifeline. And by 2021, with Zelensky in power and Russian troops massing near the border, the red line was about to be tested. By late 2021, the world watched uneasily. Over 100,000 Russian troops gathered near Ukraine's borders, tanks, missiles, and supply lines. Satellite images showed preparation for something massive. But Russia claimed it was just an exercise. Diplomats scrambled. Talks in Geneva, Berlin, and Brussels failed to cool tensions. Then came the fakes. Fabricated videos, claims of genocide in Donbass, calls for peacekeeping. The buildup wasn't just military, it was psychological. And then, on February 24th, 2022, the waiting ended. Missiles fell, columns rolled, and Europe faced its largest war in generations. History doesn't repeat itself, but it whispers. From Yalta to Crimea, from red lines to broken promises, this conflict was written in the margins of Cold War treaties and in the silence of what came after. The world moved on, but Russia didn't. And Ukraine? It became the battlefield for a history unfinished. In Part 2, we step into 2014 and the revolution that changed everything. This is Context Daily. The surface ends here.